Arbil's an application for creating metadata, as has been mentioned, so that when you archive that data, it's not a graveyard, it's actually a resource you can actually tap into. With an Arbil, you create structures for the metadata, and they can be viewed and they can be edited. Multiple metadata instances can be edited at the same time. That's when you're doing bulk editing, that speeds up the process quite a great deal. The local metadata can be searched with multiple parameters, and once you have the metadata with the resource files, you can then launch the resource files in the appropriate applications such as ELAN or a video record, video player, and so forth. Editing multiple metadata files in a single table speeds up the process a great deal. And many of these features are available in terms of accessing remote archives, for instance, search and viewing. But when you're offline in the field, you have a local data set you can always be working with. One of the things with Arbil is it's quite different from many of the metadata editors. It's designed that you can enter the data, the metadata, as it becomes available to you. So that if you don't have all the information, you can actually enter the small amount of data you do have and continue on, and then come back to that data and fill out the rest of the information later. Otherwise, you find that people, they're forced to enter the date before they enter the title, and they can't do anything until they've entered a date. And they may not know the date. And so by allowing them to continue on and warning them that they haven't entered the information later, they can continue the process and enter correct information rather than entering proxy information, which we would tend to get otherwise. So the metadata formats. So as has already been described, you have IMDI and SIMD formats, and today we're talking about SIMD, but Arbil supports both. When you start the application, the first thing you see is this wizard, and it allows you to choose which format. And it does a number of things. One is it sets the remote archives that is available, but also the templates. In terms of the user interface in Arbil, this is the interface, and on the top left-hand corner, you have the remote corpus. So this is when you have an existing corpus. In this case, it's SIMD, but it could be IMDI or, well, in this case, only IMDI or SIMD. And that will be representing the archive, which is read-only and is available online. In the local corpus, this is the area that you would actually be working. So this is the area that is editable. And down here on the bottom left, you have the working directory. So this is where your data files are. And here you have favourites, which are snippets of metadata. So often when you're entering metadata, you're doing the same information over and over again. It might be the same project, it might be the same actor or same informant. And this is an area where you can make snippets of metadata and very quickly drag it to your work area here. So you create a session for a resource file here, and then drag the snippets into the actual working area. This top right-hand corner is a preview. So when you're browsing through this tree, you're actually seeing a detailed view of what each one of these nodes actually are. Then the main work area, and this is where you have multiple tables, sometimes with one or multiple session or metadata files in the one table. So the overall workflow, if you're working with an existing archive, sorry, hang on, I'm going ahead of myself. So essentially these are the areas that you're editing and creating. So this is a tree view of your metadata and data. This is the table view and then the preview. So this is the editable areas of the application. If you're working with an archive which is online, you can then be copying sections of the archive into the local corpus. I think most of the way people are working here, that's not so relevant, but for the linguists, when they're going into the field, they'll often be working for months in the jungle with no electricity, and so being able to take a copy of their archive, or their metadata at least, with them is very useful, but maybe not so useful in this case. Then these same online archive metadata sections can actually be created directly as favourites. So you can take, for instance, your project details. So if you start a new project and someone already has metadata for your project, you can take a snippet of that metadata, drag it into your favourites. Then you can start using that in your local corpus to start speeding up the process of entering all the project information immediately. Which I'm describing there, so you're dragging from here into here to get snippets of metadata. Similarly, you can do the same process by taking metadata you've created, adding it into your favourites to make more new snippets. This tab change here, so we're now looking at the resource files, and they will be added in the same fashion, so you're dragging them onto your metadata file. So the process is you would create a metadata file, you would drag a resource, one or more resource files onto that metadata file, and then start entering the metadata for that resource. Additionally, this is also particularly useful if you're working in the field, is actually backing things up to a USB disk, so that the export functionality can easily be used to take data out of the system and have multiple copies for backups. Similarly, export is what's used to then upload things into the archive. So you'll be exporting here, and then whichever archive you're using, you'll then be able to upload it there. So when you first start Arbil, you'll be shown the wizard, and in this case you'll be selecting Clarion profiles. If you're working in a larger group, you can actually pre-configure the installation. So on the machine that the users will be having, you can actually install off the settings file, so it's automatically will have the profiles that they need to be used. And this is the manual process. So you'll be going to the options menu and then going to templates and profiles. And then here you have the MD options and here you have the CMDI options. And notably there's a much larger number of options for CMDI. And in this case I've selected annotation tool. And the net result of that is that when you create a metadata file, you have annotation tool from this dialog here, it's then available in the add menu. When you've actually added an instance like that, you then have in your work area here, you have an instance of the metadata you can start filling out. It's also available here, and so you can then take files and start dragging files there. Okay. So in terms of the display of the metadata, you have the tree is one, there are two main areas, there's the tree and then there's the table. In this case, the tree is displaying, so the remote corpus where you have, as Dan was mentioning, the tree-like structure of the metadata coming down here, and then each one of these represents a metadata file. Whereas within these instances, you actually have the components within that file. So for instance, this would be presumably the language. So this is the profile, and this is a component language within that CMDI profile. And this would be the component component country. So the main thing here is that this is indicating that it's a file, and this is a subsection of that file. All of these subsections can be added as favourites. Now, when you're viewing things in the table, you can take for instance, take 4 files and display them in a long view in the table. So you can actually view over all of them and see what information is actually there. And in this case, there's an error. So this doesn't actually conform to the control vocabulary. So this icon here is indicating there's a control vocabulary. So again, you'll see later, when you're creating your profile, you can create a control vocabulary and you can either make it, can you open and closed? Probably not. But so if the list doesn't comply, if the data entered doesn't comply with the control vocabulary, it will actually give you a warning there. The user can continue, but the main thing is that they can see that there is a problem and they can fix it when they actually know the information. Okay. So there's the two views as I just mentioned. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So this is a long view where you can actually be editing all the different files, the same section of the different files in one go. So you can actually see if there's something missing, you can then update this information. So it could be actually correcting these things in this list. Alternatively, in the long view, we're only looking at one single file. So that's this file here. So of these four, we're just looking at this one. And then you're seeing the entire list of all the metadata at that level of that file. And the other way of editing is actually in the long field editor, because some of these things, for instance, description here, is far too long to actually show in a table cell. And so you're actually looking at it in a large view, and then you have the next and previous buttons, which then allows you to jump between the different fields. So you can start at the top of the file and work your way through one by one every single field. So the control vocabularies are read from the schema file. In the case of MD, it's read by an XML file. And both are available as a drop-down list in the menu. So this is the control vocabulary icon. There are a few others, but that's the main one. And then you get this list, which corresponds directly with the list in the component editor, which will be displayed, presented later. So as I mentioned, the favourites are snippets of metadata. So you can create entire new instances from a favourite. So you could have the entire file as you need it to be and then make an instance of it. Or you can just take the desired section, such as an individual or a project. So in this example, well, initially, firstly, while it's still within the favourites, you can actually edit all of the metadata. So you can take from your local corpus, you could create one, and then take out the instance-specific data and just have, for instance, your project information. And then from there, you can actually make instances. So from here, we're going on to the local corpus. We're going add from favourites, and then adding that sample, which corresponds to the name here. And then you have an instance of. And so then I've taken that, I've then modified the name of it, and then you could modify any other relevant details to that specific piece of data you have. Similarly, adding resource files. So you would create a metadata instance in the similar, either by the add menu or by favourites. And then I've changed that to modify the name. And the blue indicates that the file has been modified, but that field has not been saved. And then by selecting and dragging a resource file into that instance, it then adds that as a resource file to that metadata. And that's the result. Then, if there are other sections within that metadata you wish to add, so we've gone on to this metadata file, and then we're going to the add menu, which is down here. And then these are fields. So this is just a single field, whereas these are actually components. So this would be languages, etc. So, and in this case, I think I should go through it. So in that case, I've added code. So this component country, it has a single field which is code, and which also has a drop-down, as a control vocabulary, which is different to adding a single field. And when you're adding a field, it does the same level of the metadata, but adds only one single field here, which is highlighted so you can see which one's just been added. This comes into play when you say, for instance, with description, you might want to have only a single name field, but you might want any number of description fields. So you might have a description in Spanish and a description in English or in French, etc. In searching the metadata, within Arbil there's a built-in search which is object-based, and it searches the tree structure. As Dan sort of alluded to before, I'm also working on a XML database version, which gives a number of features which you don't have in Arbil. We can, at a later demonstration, we can show that. So, because it's tree-based, you'll be selecting a section of the tree you wish to be searching, and then you have a number of options. So in this case, I'm searching for the word tribal, and then come up with 3 different files which have the word tribal in them. If you add, by clicking the add button here, you get another set of parameters. And then making that either, we then find anything that has tribal or the word instance within the metadata. And so you find either. The table of results here is like any other tables in Arbil, so they're all editable. You can do all of the same things with those tables. There are a number of other features in Arbil to make it easier to work with. So for instance, find and replace. It's quite low on the screen, so I'm not sure if everyone can see. But you have a find text field, and then the find next button, and you also have a replacement text field with replace selected, etc. So with that, you can type in some text and then start searching for fields within that table. And if you're doing replace, the result is to then replace that text. And again, they show up as blue because those changes have not been saved. When you save that, that goes away. Other things which are useful in terms of editing the metadata is highlighting the text. So if you're looking for misspellings or for particular names, trying to organise things, you can then select a cell and say, I want to highlight. This data projector doesn't show this very well. I've selected highlight tribal mask, and that word has been highlighted in each case. Sorry, the blue is not a very good choice for this projector, but you just have to trust me that these are actually highlighted. So, in conclusion, Arbil is to be developed with a strong focus on usability and workflow. The user can edit the metadata at any stage without requiring you to enter specific data before you move on to other sections. If you do need to move on to other sections without entering all of the data, you will be given warnings, so you know that there are things that are missing, but you're not prevented from working. And it's hoped that this will lead to people entering the metadata at an earlier stage, allowing greater quality of that metadata. That's all. Thank you.
Questions? No, then I might have a question, or at least a topic for discussion. What do you think is reasonable as an amount of metadata files to create by hand using Arbil? You know what I mean, right? Sometimes you have there is simply too much to do, while there is already, let's say, the primary input for the metadata is available in other formats, for instance, tables or Excel sheets, for instance. When does it become interesting to write specific scripts and not use Arbil?
If I was needing to do 1,000 metadata files within a week, I think Arbil would probably not be the right tool. If it was 1,000 metadata files over a year, gradually, then I would use Arbil. However, there are other things we're doing as well. So for instance, I'm currently working on a bulk import, so you can actually select a destination and a favourite and a directory of files, and then it will create metadata files for every single file. But that's not ready yet, so that's going to be a few months, I guess, before the next release.
Yeah.
But at the moment, I would say at about 1,000.
Yeah.
So, however, the application can handle more files than that, but it's more about thinking about the steps in the process, because the way this was designed was for when linguists originally were in the field, they'd be, say, taking a video, so they'd have about 5 or 6 files per day. They would then be creating metadata for each file. And so it's a very instance-specific process. And so that's what this is, the workflow is very much designed around that.
Yeah, I think it's important to realize the context in which this tool was developed.
Yes.
And although it can be applied more generally to other workflows, There are inherent limitations to
Yes.
what you would do, and it's important to realize that before you start with the task of editing metadata.
Yeah.
But in general, for us, it's very usable. But there are, of course, circumstances when you have very many metadata files to create, and you would be better off creating very specific scripts to do so.
Similarly with the search, like the search works well with about 1,000 files. If there's more than 1,000 files, the search, because it's an object base, it takes too much memory. The reason it's an object base is that, again, this was designed for linguists in the field, and so you don't want to have a complex system behind it, because if they're in the jungle, they're lucky if they have electricity, let alone internet connection. So if something goes wrong with the program, you can't afford to have that loss. And so it's using the XML files, and that's all it's using. It's XML files and Java. And that makes it stable and reliable, and that if anything does go wrong, we can actually repair anything because it's just XML files. But in many of your cases, you want a more complex system. And so the thing that I'm working on at the moment, which is the XML database, is giving a faceted tree and a much more complex search. And that can deal with many, many more files. Like with the other application I'm working on, it's starting at 4,000 upwards. So there are a lot of things that are adapting the initial core of the application without compromising the basis of the application.